All right, so 1 Peter. We'll be reading from the text in just a moment and continuing our ongoing study of the book. But before we get too far, let's bow our heads together in prayer, and then after that we'll begin our class. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the times we share together and study. Help us to be good students, good listeners, good readers. Help us to properly understand your message and mature our faith. Help us to make good application. We also ask that you be with the families here at Eastside. Help us all to honor and glorify your Son. And in all things, we offer our hearts and lives to you in this prayer. And we do so through the authority of Christ. Amen. All right, so as noted, we are in 1 Peter in the 3rd chapter. So right now, if you want to go ahead and turn to chapter 3, we're going to be reading in a moment from verses 1 through 7. That's the primary text for today. As we do that, let's, as always, make sure that we're being careful with kind of how we read ourselves into the Scriptures. It's an important principle that I try to keep in mind. I like to read slowly when I'm reading by myself. I like to read carefully. That is, making sure that I don't get lazy with skipping words. Because I don't know about you, but the more familiar you are with something, the more likely you are to kind of skim or scan. And so I do that. But when I'm reading the Bible, in addition to all the great things that you probably have similar principles to as well, I try to remember this. There are a couple of things that are super important. Number one is to realize that all biblical text, Genesis to Revelation, is separate from the cultures to which it was written to and in. All right? So that means that the language of each of the different parts of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is very cultural at times, in that whether it's Akkadian, Hebrew, Babylonian, Greek, etc., Aramaic, that's part of that culture, so that affects which words they pick. But that's separate from the culture to which it was received. So when it talks about relationships, like a family or marriage, I have to pay attention to make sure that I am aware that I am not locked into the culture to which it was written, and I'm locked into what God declared. And that happens for all of us because we bring, and that's what bias looks like, we bring our bias to what a thing looks like. This is a way that's super easy to illustrate. How many of you, if I said, right now, close your eyes, we'll try this exercise. Picture a church building with your eyes closed. Now open them up, and how much does that image look like this building inside of it? Well, for some of us, like I'm right here, this is a church building. How many of you had a little white building out in the country? I freely admit that that's the first thing that comes to mind with church building. So we have this sense within us that we know what a thing is based on experience. So here's the next step of that. How should pews be arranged in a church building? And it's okay to say, well, how they are here, right? That's how you think they should be set, right? Rich, what was the Forest Grove church building arrangement for those pews there? Do you remember?
Yeah, 2 outside, 2 middles.
Yeah, there was four sections in that particular building. And the further you got to the edge, there was more curve to those pews. So actually at the edge seats, super uncomfortable because you didn't know what to look like where am I supposed to be looking? And to make it even weirder, so you have this kind of arched setup. The pulpit was like right here and like up, right? And it's kind of elevated some. So you could be sitting right there and your seat had you looking like across the room almost, but the guy's like right here. That was normal for that group. They met there for a long time. I don't know exactly how many years. They had bought a building and then eventually sold it, and now they meet somewhere else in the community. But one more. We'll use another Oregon congregation, the Beaverton building. What are those? What's the shape of that church building? Haley, do you remember what it looks like? Yeah, it's got a little fancy octagon shape, and the pews are arranged in a way where if you're on the sides, you're kind of sitting, you can see right across the building to your brother or sister who's sitting that way, and singing is great there. It really is. Now, that's our view of what worship looks like physically. First century, most of the Christians met, if they met in a building, dispersed in synagogues. Synagogues were typically rectangular with a table about half this size for the scrolls to reside on, kind of in the middle. And some of them were gender segregated in seating, some were not. It depended on where it was and what was going on. But can you imagine being in the round to worship and the guy who's speaking just is kind of wandering in the middle? Yeah. Here's the thing. Any one of those things is fine. They all meet the more generic expectations of a place to meet, convenience of seating, maybe some sort of head covering over the top to cover you from the rain and the elements and the sun, but not always. All that's fine. The same thing happens. That's a pretty easy one. Oh yeah, it's just a building. It's not a big deal. Like, what's the big deal? We all have preferences. I love them all. Even the ones that are super ornate, they're interesting to me. You know, all that stuff, architecture. It's probably good that we don't have great architecture because I would be super distracted. Like, that's just my me thing. Oh, that's cool. So we do that there. We also do that, though, in other areas, like the marital relationship. We bring our culture to it. We bring our background to it. We do that with aspects of our understanding of whom God is. We bring our bias that way. So every time we get to a passage that we know we have potential bias, we've got to be careful to make sure we're not taking our experiences and making them be the standard. And when we can see it when it's in an easy area, that's super important, because when it's not so easy, that means we have to put a little extra effort in to make sure we're careful. Because society goes back and forth on this particular issue of the relationship of husbands and wives and how that manifests in various societies throughout history. And Christians sometimes are in line because of God's teaching with culture, and sometimes we're not in line with how the culture around us is, because God is saying, no, that's not how it is. And that will always be the case. So let's read together right now. Let's go with, Les, do you want to read? I think you've got the ESV, right? Yeah, so could you read the 7 verses for us, verses 1 through 7?
Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When you see you're respectful in pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, wearing of gold, or putting on clothing. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hope in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered.
Here's a question for you. Have you ever encountered someone who wants to come up and fight you about these 7 verses in your conversations about what husbands and wives' relationships should be like? Or what it means to be modest? Or what submission looks like? Or what any of these small details look like? Of the Bible passage, and I'll add this, of the Bible passages that tend to incite emotion in response to it, this is on my list of things that people get upset about it. even if they're not feeling like any of this stuff actually is them. Even if their lifestyle has nothing to do with this. Even if they live in a structure that's exactly like this. This is like, oh, let's go. Gloves off. Here's the fun thing. Nearly everybody I've encountered, no matter where they are, fight me or not, struggles to figure out how to apply what's in here. Because all believers say, yeah, there's something for me here. But we all don't know what to do with it half the time. Because here's the thing. Here's an illustration of it. Is it sinful for a Christian to braid their hair? But wait a minute. Did it not say that braiding has some sort of negative connotation, notes to it? It said, again, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry. How many of you have gold jewelry of some kind or another on you at this point? I planned ahead. I do not. But that would also be the case normally because gold's not my thing. But you think about that for a moment. So we already admit that we're having to do the job of a mature Christian and understand and apply. Now, another phrase for that is different from the understanding of prophecy is to interpret. To say, God said this. What did he mean? And what does he want me to do?
If you didn't do that, you'd be really in trouble with the next statement because it says, or putting on clothes.
Yeah. Yeah, the ESV says, or the clothing in the most broadest sense, the clothing you wear.
If the clothing won't cause a distraction, I think that's when
Yeah. Here's the hard thing to catch this, and I love that, and this is why I had Les read it for us, is that there is a little bit of a word play going on that's saying, this is what you think should draw your attention. And he uses these three illustrations of how you do your hair, the gold that you wear, and the clothes that you choose. He says that should be the second thing, in essence, a person sees about you. The first thing should be what?
Heart, the hidden person of the heart.
Now I want you to think for a moment. How hard is it to see the character of a person?
It's not hard.
It's only difficult when you don't know them, right? The illustration that I always use, because I have been guilty of it myself, and I have been the victim of it myself, is the parent with the child in the grocery store checkout line. How many times have you said to yourself, give me 5 minutes with that kid, this problem will be ended? And you have forgotten when you had your own kids that they're not crying because they're disobedient. They're probably crying because they missed their nap. Or they had to go grocery shopping and it took 2 hours because there's kids there. It's a lot easier to shop without kids crawling all over you. And that kid is being a kid. And they just want out. They just want out of this grocery store. But we judge right then. So I can fix that. And that mom probably be like, look, if you could fix this, I'll give you all my money, right? Because she also knows you can't, because that's not the problem. So we make snap judgments based on the appearance. We don't know the character of the kid or the mom. We're just judging, and unrighteously so. So in this instance here, this admonition in the middle of this larger text is saying what matters is not what you think would matter. Is this a first century problem or a 21st century problem? Yeah, it's a since the beginning problem. And we see it manifest itself in lots of ways. I have taken to, and this is my behavior, you don't have to do that, but if I'm going to buy a vehicle at a dealership, I am very careful with what I wear. You know why I do that? David, why does it matter what I wear if I go to a car dealership?
What you wear more, it illustrates what you can afford.
Before I pull out any information about me, they've determined who's going to work with me.
Depends on who the salesperson is.
Right. And most of the salespersons aren't any good because they've only been there for 6 months. Like it's a hard business and you don't excel at it well. So I come in and I intentionally dress down. Way down. And it's totally intentional because I want to be judged. I want to be judged as impoverished. I ain't got no money. And I know I'm not going to get the best salesman too. I know I'm going to get the guy that's new to the job. That's intentional because we do that. That's a human thing. And I'm working in that regard. Well, go back to the context of what's being laid out here. Wives, be subject to your own husbands. So even if some do not obey by word, they're going to get won by your behavior here, your conduct. That's a challenging expectation placed into the hands of half of humanity. That your behavior has the potential to come around for a second evaluation on the basis of what God has said. And this image is said, don't do this. This is in context. The context is actually in the marital relationship, not just in general. Because remember, that's the top of the sentence. Marital relationship. Don't sway them by your hair, your gold, and your clothes. Sway them by your conduct. Because that's verse 1. We can't separate them from each other. Now, read yourself back into the history of God's people. From Genesis to Malachi. Any instances of women, or men for that matter, trying to sway people by their dress, their speech, their attire, their hair. Esther, story there, makes a counter-narrative in regards to how the king perceived a woman and didn't see who she was. But who she was actually royal in her character, and that eventually manifested over time, even though it was in the midst of a very broken beauty pageant type story. And then in Proverbs, the wisdom of the mother to the son is to learn to discern between the woman who looks like royalty and the woman who acts like royalty. And the one who acts like it is the worthy woman at the end. Like she is the one who is exalted at the close of the story because of her ethic, her praise from the community, and who she is, which is counter, I got you, Bobby, to some of the patriarchs' behavior model. Ooh, I want the beautiful one. I want to marry her. Oh, you tricked me? I guess I'll wait 7 more years to get the one that I wanted instead of the one that you gave me. This is a normal juxtaposition in the text where man's desires, God's plans are always in the balance that way. Bobby?
I would say Sarah set the right example for what she treated Abraham.
Yeah, and here's my side point to that. Note that Abraham is chastised when he doesn't value his wife. In the same relationship, she praised him and he treated her as a commodity. He lied about the relationship out of fear rather than trusting her, but eventually it came round where she is shown to be equal in many ways. And that's part of the story. It's like she is an heir. She is balanced. And we've got to, again, like we sort through, like Abraham is praiseworthy, but not always praised. Just like David can be praiseworthy and not always praised. And Sarah, because she's praiseworthy, but she also engages in behavior that's not worthy of praise. So these are uniform stories in the Bible that are trying to teach us how to understand something that culture struggles with. How many of you have heard a statement in public discourse that says, women are oppressed? You ever heard that before? Yeah. It's like, hey, of course. How many of you have heard that it's men who oppress women? I don't deny that's a reality. It's 100% true. Absolute. You know who else oppresses women? Other women. 100%. You know who oppresses men? Women. You know who else oppresses men? Other men. History shows us that independent of gender, you can have tremendously horrible leaders, both genders. How many queens enacted of various types of genocides, regicides, etc.? Just like kings do. And history shows that those who are oppressed, the minute that they escape their oppression, who do they become? The oppressors. Straight up. It happens every time. A portion of them, because they're people. They're humans. And humans are dumb, greedy, selfish, etc. Bob?
The man at the head of the house. Does that work all the time?
Well, it doesn't come across that way. And in fact, there's a balance of leadership that you can have the head of the home as the Bible presents it, but that same individual has to submit in relationships inside the home, outside the home, independent of gender. Subjection, submission is not ever scented to be in this totality between humanity. There's only one entity that all mankind universally submits to, which is God. But we submit to one another. She says, no, I don't. It's my way or the highway. Well, stop lying to yourself, if that's what you've said before, and realize that when you do what is called a compromise, you are learning to submit to the desires and needs of somebody else. Compromise, it's promise with a co on it, so you're promising together to meet this middle space. You do it all the time. Compromises come in small forms and big forms. They come in the adjustments of life. They come in dietary choices. They come across the board. They're not always in this big fluffy moments where all the pageantry is, I made a decision. No, the compromise might be as simple as, which house do we both like? When you're trying to figure out which home to pick. Or which tie to wear today. You're compromising. And you're submitting to another's opinion. Bobby?
I would say it this way, if one don't submit, it'll be like hooking two mules together, and then pulling in separate ways.
Yeah, and you'll notice in all those relationships, there are areas where one is stronger than the other in various parts of this. And the interesting thing is, submission requires both the weaker to accept the status of being weaker, but the stronger to hold back. I'm probably a good 100+ pounds bigger than most women, right? So if I'm going to do a physical task that has a woman pulling on the same thing, can I pull at my full strength? What's going to happen to any woman that's next to me trying to keep up? How quickly are they going to get dragged? But together we always accomplish more, even if I hold back and they give 100%. And yes, logically I know that there are women on the planet who are physically stronger than me. Doesn't change the relationship. That just means I am the one who is being benefited by their successive strength, and the relationship still gets managed in the middle.
Well, the Scripture tells us when we are to put others ahead of ourselves, that makes us be submissive.
Yeah. And in context, it uses an illustration. It says, treat them as a weaker vessel. It actually doesn't explicitly call them weaker vessels. It says you treat them as a weaker vessel. In doing some research related to this, they've done some studies recently to try to replicate the physical pain that a female endures as a consequence of the biological process to produce life. In particular, the menstrual cycle and the period cramps that take place, and even in childbirth. Obviously, I have zero experience to that pain, right? That's the answer to that. Many of you are like, it's not good at all. If you were to sit down and describe the process, all the stuff that goes into that, super painful. And so they have like a system where they can dial it up. You can get locked into it, and you can go from 1 to a full 10, and all the physical cramps and pains that go on with it. How many of you guys want to sign up to do that every month? Dudes, you in with me? Every month we're going to just latch onto it and do like 4 days, 7 days of random cycles of pain level 0 to 10. How many guys are with me? Like, we aren't with you at all. That's dumb, right? That's our understanding that someone is identified as worthy to treat as the weaker vessel may be enduring on a regular basis through no individual fault of their own pain that you or I may not be able to endure. Or maybe we can't. Who knows? That's not the relevant point. The reality is they're strong. They're physically strong and emotionally strong in ways that are different than our own. And yet, a relationship of respect and submission is the biblical picture. Now, that may be different than the idea of submission based on your childhood. Submission was categorized in ways that only manifested in the traditional family structure unit of the 50s. So that meant husband, wife, 2 kids at home. Wife stayed at home, managed the home. Husband worked doing something somewhere, either physically, otherwise. But reread Proverbs 31. Is that individual there purely what we would consider a 50s homemaker? Is she out of order from God's design of the relationship of husband and wife? So we've got to make sure, this is my point, we can't institute the idea of submission on the basis of a 50s model of a marriage, which probably never existed, by the way. But it's just a caricature, it's just like a pet drawing, and say that's what it is. No, it's more nuanced and more cultured, more rounded than that angular presentation, and still involves a relational expectation of submission in this sense of relationship. And there are problems if you go too far one way or the other. If you turn this relationship into a dictatorship, are you matching the biblical standard of submission and relationship in both directions? Well, my husband told me this is the way it has to be, and so I just do exactly what they said, even though he's wrong. And we're going to die because of his foolishness. The Bible shows women stepping up and saying, "Oh, you're dumb. I'm going to save our family by negotiating peace." Just as it might happen today with other minor or major issues. So that concept of submission is something that we struggle at, especially, I will suggest, in the application space of not only newly married, but those of us who are set in our ways. The more set we are into our behaviors, the harder it is for us to sort out this concept of how to moderate these behaviors into a relationship. So before we go back into the text again and talk about the spiritual ramifications of winning a soul by your behavior, what's some of your observations about this idea of submission, looking at the biblical text, culture, 21st century application? What are you thinking? Is this something that Christians still need to work on and get better at?
The culmination of all of it is as much for us as it has been any generation. It's the interpersonal. And then it takes all of it to be the right interperson. It takes the submission, and it takes the willingness to compromise.
Yeah.
But it all shows it's an attitude.
It's the attitude that both partners have to build and adjust to on the course of them learning each other. Preferences, ideas, what matters, what works, things that really matter, things that don't matter. Abraham and Sarah are a great example of that Peter uses here, in that, yes, Sarah followed Abraham's lead even when it was foolish. But she was never passive about it. She quietly would go to him. She would go to him more sternly. They would discuss, the scripture shows these interactions. Sometimes they agreed to do things together dumbly. She could lead there. Sometimes they solved problems through her compassionate care of others, and sometimes they made them worse because they're people. They're human beings that are not just magic little boxes that do exactly what we want them to do. And their failures are shown to us too. So with that as part of our picture, understanding that submission in the Bible is an expectation, it's a relational expectation. There are structures that are biblical from the Old Testament and New Testament that supersede culture. Christ is shown to be the head of all, and the relationship of husband and wife is used as an illustration of the marital relationship, where the husband is identified as the head, both with consequences and praise. But it doesn't mean that the woman has no role. In fact, she has the complementary side piece role to it, that they then work together and accomplish their missions together and their works together, as it should have been in the garden, but it wasn't, because it was broken by their own behavior. So all that takes place. So this text then is identifying how it seems someone who has yet to submit to Christ as a Messiah, and then as the Messiah, and then as the Son of God, could look to the behavior of the obviously believing spouse and see God through that relationship. Some over the years I've heard a lot of comments that says one of the first interactions that a young person has of who the father is by their own father. And they either seek to find someone who has shown them Christ like their dad did, or because their dad didn't show them Christ, they go seeking for it. I've heard that illustration before. Maybe you have too. This is in essence saying on a different level, this husband will reevaluate who Jesus is and who God is on the basis of how his wife behaves. Does that make sense to you based on your relationships in life? Do you see people changing their whole life on the basis of how someone treats them? Yeah, all the time. Positively and negatively. How many of you have been mistreated in life? How many of you behave differently because of that mistreatment? Right, all of us should. Not only do we reject the mistreatment, we most likely, especially those who are Christians, are more compassionate to those who have experienced or are in the middle of those kind of mistreatment situations. But history also shows us that those who have been abused without course correction become abusers. They replicate that because that close connection affects them going forward. So, in the closest relationship that the Bible defines among two people, It's showing that the behavior of one can strongly influence the most important attributes of another. Something also isn't a big surprise. And the context isn't really about regulating everyday behaviors of dress, of gold, of hair, which are regulated by your character. Like that's who you are, chooses those things. But really saying who you are affects who someone is around you. And that's pretty normal. But in this case, it's amplified in a way that says this can actually work. So let me ask you a question. How many of you have seen this come to pass in the lives of people around you? Where a believing female spouse, by their behavior, changed the heart of an unbeliever. You ever seen that? I've seen it in the lead up to marriages. I've seen it in marriages. I've seen it in other relationships in life too. And it's not what they say, it's what they do. That's a hard thing to conceptualize because we always want to be able to just tell someone, hey, this is what you should be doing. It's much easier, right? Here's my list of 10 steps. If you'll follow these 10 principles in life, you'll be amazing. Let me show you what life can look like. And do it every day. That one's harder, right? That's the conflict that's kind of taking place to a degree in here, is to understand all of the other Bible passages that are written specifically about the husband and wife relationship are then summarized in this way with a evangelistic forward mindset. Because there's lots of Bible teaching from Genesis to Revelation that pops up regarding the nature of the relationship of husband and wife. Whether it's Song of Solomon on the romantic side, whether it's Corinthians on some of the relational sides, whether it's Paul's other teachings in Ephesians, etc., that talk about the relationship that Jesus talks about in the Gospels. But here it is activated and says this can work. So let me ask the next step question. Since we all kind of mentally acknowledge, yeah, I've seen that, or I could see it working. How does this then regulate how we behave in a marriage? So let me talk to the believing husbands first. How does this passage regulate your behavior in a marriage / your marriage? Do you understand, what does it make you do, think, or believe about how you need to act and speak?
Definitely, it's supposed to have an effect on the way we not only we do our control our lives or around our family and our husbands or wives, but also other people in the workplace. I've seen this same thing. The character of people affect people that work around them.
Yeah, if you have to tell somebody you're in charge, are you in charge?
No.
Universally not. And so if the expectation here is, it says, wives submit to husbands. Note for husbands, if you ever start telling her, I'm the husband, I get to decide this, you've lost. Like right then. And not only have you lost the argument or the opportunity, note the last part of the passage. You've forsaken the effectiveness of the prayers that you offer. For you, for your family, for her, for anyone else. Because you've lost sight of that relationship. So that's like first layer. Second layer, once you realize you can't assert it, you also can't go in expecting it. Because there's another human on the end of the relationship. And this passage is actually about her power, not yours. which is something that we struggle with at times, is to figuring out what to do with the inherent powers that we have in life. So the second part of this is to capture and recognize, not only can I not falsely assert it, nor should I go walking around expecting it. I actually have to recognize I need to serve in that role. And like we talked about last week, we mentioned again, leadership isn't just puffery. It's not just puffing up and saying, I'm the guy, let me tell you all the things. Leadership, scripturally and biblically, is most often typified by sacrifice and service. And Les pointed this out earlier, setting their needs as greater than your wants or needs. And you forego because, hey, this would be better for them. Even though I might want this or that. And so that leadership capacity there isn't always seen. But when it's practiced, it starts having the impact that you desire to have, that you're building this relationship with leadership, saying, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to make sure I get in front of the problem, so I take the brunt of it, so the people behind me don't really get affected by it in the ways that they think. And maybe it allows me to develop as an individual on the male side in a way that demonstrates this full commitment to Christ as my king. And I can act like a king rather than saying I'm the king of my castle. Right? Flip the tables the other way. We got just about 2 more minutes. We turn that table around, go the other direction. How should this passage regulate the behavior of a woman in a marriage? Yeah, like it's a demonstration of who God is. Here's my 1950s kind of placard about that. Think about it this way. There used to be a lot of articles and things written, like Good Housekeeping articles, like stuff that gets pulled back out from history and says, you know, women, if you want to show your man that you care about him, he will come home to a home with a meal made and your hair has been done and the house is spotless and your makeup is perfect. And that's how you're going to show him that you really care about him. Look, great meal when you get home is awesome. Clean house is awesome. But that's the counter narrative of this text. Because it actually says, don't do those things if you want to win the heart of your husband. Which is weird, right? Because you tell a dude, hey, you're going to get home, the house is going to be spotless, dinner's going to be ready for him. He's going to be excited about that because who wouldn't be, right? But that's not how you win their heart. That's how you win their stomach, their appetites, their desires. Their heart is won by your behavior, which is all the rest of the stuff. Regulating your behavior to set that as a goal, think about what you can accomplish then. Not only can you change their soul's trajectory, but maybe the course of an entire community. All right, that's it for today. We'll have to stop right here. We'll be back in 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 8. Thanks, everybody.